Cameron, and obviously you know quite a bit about football over there in the AFC East. Patriots leading that division at 3-2. You also have a little nugget on the New York Jets. We'll get to you right after this game break. Phil, what do you have over in New York? First time we go to this Monday night game, and we have a score update midway through the third.
Yeah, for a while this game was a relatively, boring game. It looked as though Houston, had this pretty well under wraps. There was a 7-7 tie until Arian Foster breaks that with another score, making it 14-7. Since then, they'd kicked 2 more field goals, making the score 20-7. And then recently, we had just had a kick return touchdown, putting the Jets right back in it. Obviously, people saying if the Jets are going to have any chance in this game, they need a touchdown on defense. They need a touchdown on special teams. Something that takes a little bit of the burden off of their offense, which is exactly what they're able to get there. The score now being 14-20, and with about 4 minutes left in the third, the Jets not quite out of it just yet.
Obviously, the Houston Texans, all they can reckon with the New York Jets. On the scoreboard, they're up by 6, 20-14, with 4 minutes remaining in the third quarter. And Joe McKnight putting the Jets on the scoreboard with a 100-yard kickoff return touchdown. Now, Cameron, we'll send you right back, onto the stage here. You have a little, quarterback kind of facts that you have with Mark Sanchez and just that overall football team in the locker room. The Jets are one of those teams that, in a way, are heading backwards. Certainly could use a big win today. Cameron, what do you have for us?
J.P. Pelsman came on my show yesterday. He's a staff writer, actually, for The Record in New Jersey, who covers the New York Jets. He says that this is a different Jets team. This is not a Jets team that typically would throw tirades. We saw that issue happen against Miami after that game with Santonio Holmes. We saw in the offseason Bart Scott, getting it in with a reporter, really, sending threats, and it really got into aggressive commentary. But now, the Jets, they seem a little bit more poised. They're not showing any type of emotion that would cause any signal or red flag. According to JP, he says that the Jets team are extremely motivated. During the week, they had many defensive meetings showing Carlos Rogers' comments. Both those of you who don't know who Carlos Rogers is, he's a 49er cornerback, and he said that the Jets aren't good. He had all these derogatory comments about the Jets, and they've used that to fuel themselves. And though it may seem obvious, the Jets are trying to bounce back, but they've gone through a lot. They're using Carlos Rogers' comments to fuel them, and it's shown here in this one. I have to say, with all the Tebow talks, with all the drama, if they can keep it close, and Sanchez... Oh, by the way, before I even get to that, I just want to mention, according to JP, he has a feeling that if this is just a feeling that he's had around the whole entire team. If the New York Jets lose this football game and Mark Sanchez has multiple turnovers, he had one at the end of the first half. If he has multiple turnovers and they lose this football game, Tim Tebow will be in next week, according to JP. That's his prediction, and that's what he thinks. So the Jets, they've been going through a lot, but if they win this game, wouldn't be surprised with all they've gone through this entire week to prepare for this matchup.
Obviously, the sports writer over there, JT, certainly more knowledge about the New York Jets than the average New York football fan. And right now, the Jets trailing on the scoreboard. And if the Houston Texans, despite, kickoff return, and the Jets are still in the game and seemingly just hanging around, the Colts were in that kind of situation with the Packers this week. If the Jets can just hang in there and figure out a win, what to make of the Jets? Will they keep going with Sanchez? It seems like, from what Cameron, what you've said, this is a rejuvenated squad. I feel, I'm agreed with Phil on, Rex Ryan is not one of those coaches I'm not a huge fan of, not one of the elite as far as offense and full-on discipline. He's seemingly going too hard with his football team, and obviously the Jets have gone backwards in the last few years. What to make of the Jets? If they win this football game, do they stick with Sanchez, or do they go with Tim Tebow and try and, put that experiment and try and put that, Sanchez talk to rest with having Tebow in the lineup?
To me, well, according to JP, he says point blank that what he's felt like around the locker room and what he senses, with what's been going on, that he just thinks that Tebow is really, he currently right now has a really good opportunity next week if the Jets lose this one, no matter what. So even if the Jets lose by a touchdown, or Sanchez really has to put on a show in the second half to keep his job. But according to JP, he believes that even if they do lose this game by a touchdown, you'll probably see Tim Tebow as the starting quarterback for next week.
Phil, do you believe that Tim Tebow will start next week if the Jets lose, no matter how they lose it, no matter how Sanchez plays? And also, to have a comeback question, Phil, do you believe if the Jets win that they'll go with Tebow next week, or stick it out with Sanchez, who Rex Ryan said before the year he's our franchise guy?
Well, I think it'd be very hard to explain a quarterback switch if the Jets are able to knock off, formerly undefeated Houston. So I think if there's a win, even if they want to make that change, they would have to wait until that decision is justified. If you're able to pull off a win with an undefeated team, against an undefeated team, I can't imagine a single team. What if you do that and you put Tebow in next week, and then it's his first game in and they don't do well? Jets fans saying, "What are you doing to us? We finally were working out the kinks. We had Sanchez, beating the Texans, and then you throw Tebow in now after we've been yelling for him for 2 weeks." I think that could actually be disastrous. Of course, if the Jets were to lose and lose by a lot, if Texans just pull away at this point, then I could definitely see it happening. Here's a situation, even after week one when they blew out the Jets, they had 40-some-odd points. People were still kind of whispering, yeah, that was good, but maybe we could have even done even better with Tebow. So really, it almost doesn't matter how good Sanchez does, it's just how bad he does. So the only way he's going to keep his job is if he keeps winning, because you can't really pull a guy while he's having success and make it out to be a reasonable decision.
Absolutely. Mark Sanchez in this game, 9 for 19. Certainly they're running the football, and not to mention the Houston Texans with almost double the amount of time of possession that the Jets have. Certainly the Houston Texans, outside of that kickoff return, are dominating this football game. Sanchez, 9 for 19, 135, $135, and a TD along with an INT. Mark Sanchez, an average performance, will need a really good fourth quarter. We're winding down into the third with the Texans leading by 6. And right now for Sanchez and company, if you can't pull off this game, Cameron mentioned it, I feel like it's going to be Tebow. I'm not hard-pressed to see that the Jets go with their backup quarterback in this situation.
Yeah, it's definitely, again, if he does extremely well, you can't really pulled him back for that. But if they lose this game, by however much it is, I could agree. They could lose by a field goal, they could lose by 1, they could lose by a blown call late in the game that cost them the game. If the Jets lose this game, I think it'd be all the situation they need. If they really wanted to try Tebow, that they'd be able to pull the trigger on that.
Absolutely. Now, the Houston Texans tack on a field goal now. Score update, 23-14. Texans leading with 56 seconds remaining in the third quarter. Now we'll take a trip over to the New Orleans Saints in the battle by the Bayou as the Saints pull it out. 31-24 your final. And for the San Diego Chargers, obviously, things looking down as they face the Denver Broncos next week. And also not to mention, before we get going on the Saints, Cameron Sadeghi did end our call. We obviously appreciate every single moment that we have with Cameron. Obviously, great points. He has that access with, a sports writer. Not very many, people get to have, a conversation with a sports writer, let alone, a guy from New York that certainly knows his fair share of Jets football. But over in New Orleans, Drew Brees breaks the record. 48th consecutive game with a touchdown pass. That spans over 4 years. And for the New Orleans Saints, they have a quarterback right now that can win. And certainly has that kind of, not only New Orleans swagger that you love to have over there, in New Orleans, but certainly a guy that has gone through the kind of battles that you hope to have, in your quarterback. He's a tough guy at only 6 foot, and certainly, the Saints are a team to reckon with, even though they're only 1-4. A battle for the postseason is on, despite the bounty gate right now for New Orleans. Nothing for their quarterback that would like better than a trip to the playoffs and a fight for the Lombardi Trophy.
Yeah, they finally get the win they've been looking for. They're 1-4. It's definitely still an uphill battle, to make that playoff berth. And obviously, last night having, a game to remember as a record formerly held by Johnny Unitas for most consecutive games with a touchdown pass, being 48 straight games. Definitely a big moment. It's good that it got to come in his home stadium, in a big win against the San Diego Chargers.
Absolutely. Now for the New Orleans Saints, a huge uphill battle for the Saints. And right now at 1-4, still 2 games, outside of, over there in the NFC South. It's a uphill battle, but believe it or not, the rest of the division, though, outside of course, the Atlanta Falcons, struggling. Big time struggling. The Carolina Panthers just can't seem to get their offense going. And, of course, the other team in the NFC South, nothing too much to make, of that entire division. Of course, the New Orleans Saints have a huge uphill battle with 4 losses. Seemingly they have to put 3 or 4 straight to even have a chance. But right now, putting one win together, putting that, we're 0-4, put that behind you and just win. It's a 1-game season for 16 straight weeks. Putting one win together, and certainly the San Diego Chargers are a pretty good team. Now, they did lose, despite some controversial calls, but the game just seemed to go the Saints' way. Now, I don't want to go too much into this scenario, rounding out the last few minutes of our show, but right now, for this game, certainly, we mentioned this before the broadcast, it seemed to be a little slanted towards the New Orleans side. Phil, would you agree?
You can call it a little bit slanted, and I'm going to call it this. I'm going to say the Chargers completely got hosed in this game. It was definitely slanted. Late in the game, it looks like Phillip Rivers is going to drive them down the field and score a touchdown. And, it's going to break, New Orleans' heart, even though they broke the record and, they're looking for the first win on the season. That's all well and good. But, you can't let that get involved in your officiating. Here's a time they had, 2nd and 37 off of, some pretty, I'll go ahead and call it now, controversial calls as far as pass interference and a phantom holding call. And, you look, Phillip Rivers, I'm going to use your words, Nick. He probably drove them the length of the field and then some on that last drive taken back in penalties. And really, if anyone here follows me on Twitter, you'll see I put it on there. I said the Chargers, they got screwed, and Phillip Rivers is a warrior because he fought all the way through that game. He had the fumble at the end. But at that point, how much can you really, you feel like you won the game 2 or 3 times with the passes you've made, and it just keeps getting called back, and it gets frustrating. The Chargers are a very good team, and I think they got robbed last night, point blank.
Absolutely. And the thing for the NFL, the replacement officials, I was a fan of how the kind of effort that they had. They had an all-star effort, that replacement officials, and they're one of the least talent. They're not one of those officials. They're obviously backup officials that don't know the game like the starting officials do. But if I were to officiate, if I were to go out on a limb right now, the replacement officials for that game and for week number 5 would have called a better game, would have called a better series of games. Right now, for the, this refereeing situation, it's not exactly in the books. We mentioned last week, there was some plays on the line, there were some plays down the stretch, most notably in week 4, the Sproles kind of fumble that wasn't really called. It was an obvious fumble, but that it wasn't really called. And, right now for the officiating, if you were to go for the best of situation for, officials right now, for the best officiating at this moment in November, I would go with the replacement officials. The starting officials have not been, on the field, taking care of this high-speed game. Now, they do have, they have maintained the speed of the game, but certainly I want to go with the starting officials that are going to call the best games in November and December when the games are tight and when the season comes down to 1 or 2 weeks. Certainly the starting officials did not get it done, this game most notably, the Chargers, I would say it's not exactly too much of a stretch to say they got robbed. But in this game, certainly